Hey everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Broken Rails 1188th New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Jamie Hood and Melissa Lozada-Oliva. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Jamie Hood is the author of How to Be a Good Girl, one of Vogue's best books of 2020, and regards Marcel, a monthly newsletter on Proust and other miscellany. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the Baffler, Bookforum, The Nation, Los Angeles Review of Books, The New Inquiry, The Drift, and elsewhere. She lives in Brooklyn. And our host today, Melissa Lozada-Oliva, is the author of Dreaming of You and Candelaria, which was named one of the best books of 2023 by USA Today and Vogue. Her forthcoming collection of short stories beyond all reasonable doubt, Jesus is Alive, will be released this fall on Astra House Press. She runs a newsletter called Reading Sucks and teaches at the Center for Fiction and the Brooklyn Public Library. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jamie. We're going to begin with Jamie's lovely reading.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Um, I'm just going to jump right in. Hold on. Okay, so a little context. I thought because we're on Zoom today, the final chapter in the book basically takes place over Zoom. It's conversations between me and my therapist. So I thought maybe we would replicate the therapeutic process by doing a reading from that section. So I don't think there's a ton of context. It happens in the present day. Um, the therapist is called Helen in the book, and yeah, just gonna read for like 5 minutes. Was there a word that came up for you since we last spoke? Something to describe the backward looking, Helen asks in our next session. Curiosity, I say. I want to make sense of my disorder, while also granting credence to all that's ambivalent and irresolvable about life. I tell her about my walk after our conversation last week. I say I've been thinking how precarious the political moment is for survivors, one that obliges us to speak while also disciplining the boundaries and representational possibilities of that speech. I am meant, for example, to narrate my experience in unequivocal story beats, as in, I was innocent when I was found, virginal, really, and morally unimpeachable. Then those drooling beasts stumbled on me and held me at gunpoint or knife point, or I was tied up, and it was wartime. And when they were finished, my sexual life was done for. But I devoted myself to God. I gave my body over to the nuns, and thus I make myself believable. I live in deep fear, I tell Helen, of not having been the perfect victim, which is funny because so much of the impetus behind the book I'm writing has to do with upending convention, disaggregating the usual narratives of sex trauma. One of the great disappointments in Me Too was its reconsolidation of the status quo, the way it calibrated around monsters and angels. It was like Harvey Weinstein, a monster. When we put him away, great, we've solved rape. We got him. And the women the movement was kindest to were those most proximate to power. The A-list actresses whose careers were torpedoed, the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies whose careers were torpedoed, and so on. Not to delegitimize their experience, just to acknowledge that the media didn't give a shit about domestic workers being assaulted by their wealthy employers. It wasn't particularly interested in the testimonies of non-white women, and it said fuck trans women. Even today, we see a racialized specter of rape being deployed in service of genocidal war propaganda, just as it was 2 decades ago during the War on Terror. In the story of trauma, it's risky, I say, to represent oneself in a way that undermines or deviates from a politics of innocence. Spectators feel unable to track the plot. The narrative becomes less intelligible. But that's because of rape culture and misogyny. It's because of this kaleidoscopic matrix of anti-feminist rhetoric. If you produce this impossible ontology, the perfect victim, so no one's able to embody it, you create the conditions for systemic incredulity, the fiction that sexual violence doesn't happen or isn't serious, that it isn't endemic to life under patriarchy. The fact that I slept with a lot of men in the wake of my rapes becomes a crack in the porcelain. Now people can claim the assaults were only reverberations of my usual bodily habits, or say I misunderstood some foggy non-distinction between them and the sex I agreed to. I think, too, of my time escorting and the decision to write about it now, how this will render me even less credible for many people. Because our culture is so wildly suspicious of women who treat sex as capital, because women's bodies aren't meant for our power or pleasure. They're meant reproductively, as usable resources. But all sex is transactional. For the time being, there's no outside to capitalism. We don't fuck beyond the borders of the market. People refuse to face this brute fact. They perfume it and fashion fables to conceal it, which is the more insidious maneuver to my thinking. To measure sex and hourly rates exposes the lie of sociopolitically uncontaminated romance. That's why it drives everyone so fucking mad. In my video feed, I watch Olive, my dog, behind me, stretch her long dog body up onto the couch. She turns her head to stare at my back. I sense her impatience. I laugh. I'm mindful, says Helen, of our time. We part. On the train to the surgeon's office, I think of something Helen asked me earlier, whether I feel able to be human in our sessions, if I can shirk my anxiety about perfectibility, believability. Certainly, I feel able to make mistakes and contradict myself. I can grasp and marvel at my hot anger, a dangerous thing for a woman to grasp, but I grasp it. I guess in other circumstances, even with people I know well and trust, the story and tailored. I have to make its shape recognizable for a variety of possible audiences and interlocutors. Even with Kay, that's my ex-boyfriend, I think now I'd been cautious while describing the horizon of my sex trauma. 3 years in, and I hadn't really told him about it, or not in any detail. Even with him, I tidied things. When he began to cry, I switched to the abridged edition. I was so scared he'd leave. Other boyfriends had. Men hear assault and get cagey. They see you suddenly as breakable and seek distance from the wreckage. Or rather, men want you to be breakable, but they like to control the terms of that fragility. When I was single, men loved telling me how sad I looked. I saw how this turned them on. It unsettled me. I couldn't make sense of it, except to suspect they were imagining hurting me themselves. The fact is, I was sad and didn't want to be, and surely didn't want it to contrive the nature of my desirability. I think often of a scene in Mad Men when her charming equestrian crush says something to Betty Draper about her profound sadness. No, she tells him, it's just my people are Nordic, which has always struck me as funny because Betty's totally dissociated for years. Still, I admired her flintiness. I learned to guard my sadness. I tumbled myself like a stone. I remember the note I scrawled in my diary, the question of when I first felt desire, and I can't pinpoint the moment. I can't even narrow it to a fucking year. I remember the first time I willingly gave a guy a blowjob. I was 13. He was one of my best friends, but I don't remember if I really wanted to. I knew he wanted it though, and I wanted so badly to please him. I wanted so badly for him to think I was beautiful. Maybe he did. I wonder now if I've ever felt it. Desire, I mean, as improperly felt it, a desire of my own, and nothing to do with what I thought men demanded, what I believed I should perform, beyond sensations unfurling inadvertently in response to a stimulus. Where is the origin of my longing? What is it I want? Have I ever known? In the blindingly white Midtown office, two doctors ask me to disrobe. I seem always to be in doctors' offices now, on the phone with doctors, on the phone with my insurance company, having my blood drawn by bored nurses, being examined, poked, prodded, and photographed. My body is not my body. It's an assemblage. Behind their masks and their white coats, the doctors breezily discuss my vagina. I am there and not. I want to go home.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was really beautiful. Well, first of all, I want to say congratulations. You're about a week out from your book being released into the world. Trauma Plot, for those of you who don't know, is a memoir about a life that is punctured by and reshaped by three sexual assaults. And the form of this, the way that you structure this book, I've never read a book like this before, I think. And it was really inspiring as a poet who writes prose to read this book. So the first thing I want to ask you about is the form of this book. You divide it into four sections: she, I, you, and we. Um, and I felt like this was the poet of you who does this, dividing it into like a form. But at the same time, you use art as a form, as a point of like reflection in an ekphrastic way. So you talk a lot about Woolf, a lot about Sylvia Plath, Philomena, Laura Palmer, all of these, traumatized girls. All this to say, my first question for you is, can you talk to me about what informed the structure of this memoir?
Yeah. So it's funny because, like, it sort of feels like the question about the book, which is
Yeah.
great. It's very fun. Um, and I was actually talking about this with someone the other day, and I was like, it just kind of happened. It kind of happened
Mhm.
a little bit organically. Like, I did go into the book with a very like determined sense of what the structure would be, right? Like when I took the book out on submission before we sold it like 2.5 or 3 years ago, it was so elaborate. Like it was split into 9 parts. And I was like, okay, these 3 parts are going to be memoir, and these three are going to be poetry, and these three are going to be literary criticism, because I
Yeah.
like really envisioned this as more of a literary critical book than it ended up being. Um, and so, yeah, like it started out sort of in that way, and I hadn't written a ton of it. I mean, I had written a ton for the book before that, but I like when I sold it, I was like, okay, I have to figure out that's the problem I'm having is form. And when I got into the writing of it, I kind of realized that I had constructed this bizarre labyrinth of form kind of to avoid dealing with what had happened to me. It was like I was like clearly fleeing the actual content of the book and fleeing into form and formal play.
Totally. Totally.
Um, and ultimately, the book does have a lot of formal play. I think that when I sort of realized it wasn't working in that manner, I started over again. And the first part that I wrote was the second chapter, which I think is the closest to conventional memoir. Like it's first person, um, like recollection of a period of time. And I kept putting it down. I think, partly because it was first person memoir, it felt very raw. And um, yeah, I mean, it's a book about rape, and it's not an easy thing to do and to write about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of like shifted gears to the first chapter, which is in the third person. And I create like a character out of myself. So it's like it follows the day in the life of a
Yeah.
character named Jamie H., who's a grad student. And it's sort of my homage to Mrs. Dalloway. And yeah, like honestly, that was sort of the moment I realized what the book would look like in terms of shape. I like shifted gears to the third person, and it really enabled like this freedom for me and
Mhm.
imagining what the book could do. Because once I turned myself into this strange character, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a lot, but
No, no, no.
once I turned myself into a character, I felt like more at liberty to say,
Yeah.
I want to do something. All memoirs are subjective. All memoirs are constructed pieces of art, right? So once I felt less sort of beholden to like generating this very meticulous history. And I was like, what if I just tell the story in the way that it makes most sense to me and feels the
Yeah.
most honest? That sort of opened up the entire book. And I ended up writing that part first, and then I returned to the second chapter. And then the third and fourth chapters just kind of came in an evolving fashion. Like I knew I would use my diaries in the book. The third part of the book is um, second person, and it constructs like this collage from my diaries from the time I was in grad school. And I knew I would use my diaries, but I didn't know I was going to do it sort of as if I was writing a biography of my previous
Yeah.
self and like sort of
Yeah.
speaking to that previous
I
self.
loved that.
Like I didn't know that was going to be the way I would use my diaries because I use them in the second chapter too, but I kind
Mhm.
of use them in the more traditional memoirist way where you're just sort of,
Yeah.
I looked at my diaries and I saw that I had written this, and you continue
Right.
sort of assembling this narrative. And then the therapy part that I just read from, um, I really went back and forth. Both of my books, the end sections were parts that I didn't initially think I would include because
Mhm.
they just felt so vulnerable. And so like the therapy section, the therapeutic work I was doing, because I got into therapy when I was like in the thick of the writing of the book. I just like couldn't not have some sort of objective support system
Mhm.
while I was
Mhm.
doing it. Um, and thank you, Medicaid, for covering my therapy. But yeah, so like that part, I really I knew that I wanted to document the therapeutic process because I was very concerned about not getting anything out of the work that I was doing in my sessions. I was like,
Yeah.
what if I just sort of like they just dissolve, and I don't actually grow and change and like take what I'm learning in those hours.
Mhm.
I was documenting them very meticulously. Like as soon as the sessions were over, I was just like writing everything I remembered basically
Yeah.
as verbatim as I could get. But it
Yeah.
felt it felt to me like the rawest part of the book, and I wasn't sure that I was going to include it until I was like, this is inextricable from the work that I'm doing in the book.
Totally. Um, it's interesting you talk about like you felt like you were the form was helping you hide maybe. And I completely relate to that as someone who's like done elaborate like plot points and insane structure so that I don't have to, show like the most vulnerable parts of myself. Um, whenever I try to write like first person confessional personal essays, I feel like I always put my foot in my mouth. Like like I don't actually mean what I say. And for that reason, like fiction and poetry has been this like route that has been the most useful for me. I want to, speaking of the diary entries, I want to talk about I don't know if this is how you still feel about it, but like the hypergraphia of it all,
Mhm.
um or the compulsion to journal and to write. I think this book is such like an ode to confessional writing. Reading it made me feel like I really wanted to journal again. And actually, I started journaling again really intensely after reading it, which was really has been really helpful for me as a writer. But I wanted to just ask you about your experience journaling and if you still journal and the importance to you of logging memory.
Yeah. No, I mean, like it's so crucial, and this book wouldn't have been possible if I didn't keep journals.
Mhm.
I started keeping diaries when I was very young, probably like 10 or 11. And it's strange. I feel like people that I talk to, like friends of mine, have much more continuous narratives of their lives, particularly like in childhood. Like I don't remember my
Yeah.
fucking childhood at all.
Uh-huh.
And um and maybe that's depression, maybe it's trauma, who knows? Like it could be any number of things. But like I don't have like a continuous narrative of my life in my head until I'm like in middle school. And so like I think maybe that was part of the compulsion to diarize everything so that I had this document, that I had something I could turn to sort
Yeah.
of make sense of how my life operates.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, the period of time, the book mostly takes place between 2012 and 2015, and then it sort of jumps forward into the present day, and I fill in the blanks. But that period, 2012 to 2015, was probably the period of my life where I kept the most studious journals.
Mhm.
Like I was journaling truly compulsively, like 2 or 3 times a day. Like I
Yeah.
filled tons of them and I have them. And, I also, because it was such a difficult period of my life, there have been many moments where I was like, I should just burn these. Like this is not
Yeah.
something I want to have around, like
Yeah.
I had this like, and there's such a like great tradition in literature of like destroying diaries. I
Yeah.
bring it up in the book, like I think all the time about Sylvia Plath's last journals, which Ted Hughes destroyed or claims he destroyed. And so like, when I set out to write this book and I was going back through my diaries, I was like, thank God I didn't fucking destroy them because just my memories of the period are so fragmented and fractured, but I was able to go back and see like in the third part where I'm dealing with the diaries very heavily, like I was able to see day to day what was happening, what
Right.
I was doing with the day, but also what I was feeling during the day.
Right.
And sort of like reassembling that felt really, yeah, I don't know. It felt really vital to me. And it was very difficult to do to look back on that and to see like how dark that period was for me. But I'm really glad that I kept them. As far as today, it's funny because I'm in like this brilliant group chat with two of my closest friends, Charlotte Shane and Harem Walker, and we it's like a 24/7 voice call. We like send
Yeah.
voice notes all fucking day. So I feel like a lot of the detritus that goes into a journal has become
In the
sort of
group chat.
filtered into my group chat, and then a lot of the other things are sort of, siloed in therapy. Uh,
Mhm.
and so now my journals I still keep them, but they're a little more intermittent. And I think they're sort of just for places where it's like the really boring shit that I don't want to force on my friends and like the stuff that I haven't like
Process.
processed enough to take to
Yeah.
therapy. So that's
Yeah.
sort of where I am now.
Yeah, it's nice to think of the group chat as a diary. And also, it's like a lot less lonely, and you have people talking to you. And like, you're like, instead of just like writing to yourself, there's someone being like responding to you and holding you accountable.
Yeah.
Um, I want to talk about the you section, which is the where you're kind of this like acting like this like archivist historian of your diary entries. So that is completely in second person. um I'm really fascinated by the second person. A lot of poets use it in a really like instructional poetry way. When I teach the second person, I often talk about how it's used as this like traumatic response, as a form of like removal, as like I'm no longer this person, and it's a form of protection, not just protecting yourself in the present, but kind of acting like this like, older sister to the person that this happened to be like, this I'm taking care of the inner child of you, or how whatever. um but the way that you're adding this like meta way to it by becoming this like by annotating it and talking to yourself. So could you just talk to me about the ways you were thinking about second person, and how you wanted to elevate it and its usefulness for you in your writing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's great that you point out that sort of the way that the poets like do that, and like obviously there was a period of time where I like considered myself much more of a poet, and there was a period of time where this book was going to be a book-length poem, and obviously there's no poetry anymore in it. And I think the second person, sort of what you were saying, where like you have to step apart and generate this distance and kind of have some sort of correspondence with a previous version of yourself that feels maybe sympathetic or forgiving,
Yeah.
something like that. That feels very resonant for me. Um, I think in part because when I was looking back at those diaries, um, I just felt so much shame, like it was an incredibly difficult procedure. And there were when I started going back through the old diaries, like at first I was just sort of scanning them, just trying to figure out what the thread, like the continuing thread was across, say, like 3 months. I'm like, okay, what happened between, what happened? What did I write about the Boston Marathon bombings when they happened? Because I was living in Boston at the time, and they were very shocking and felt like sort of like all consuming in my memory of Boston and my time there. And then, and I felt such a recoil from myself. And then I sort of got obsessive and I was like really fixated and like feeling this like kind of disgust and shame and trying to process that, like trying to figure out like, well, if I'm not in the place where I despise myself anymore, if I'm not the bitch who's like constantly taken up by self-hatred, how can I look back at this and recognize and attend to the shame
Mm.
and sort of reckon with it, as opposed to just staying in that sort of place of negative affect? Like how
Yeah.
can I look back on that moment and generate a more expansive feeling towards myself, And so it is very much like that second person address that is sort of like, okay, this is who I was,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
period. Like,
Yeah.
and I need to be able to forgive myself. I need to
Right.
be able
And
to
there
have
can be a tenderness towards that person.
right. And I think, it's funny because in the chapter, I think there's a level of cruelty and like how I write this
Uh-huh.
chapter. I think I don't like excise that entirely because
Right.
I think that that's also important. It's important to recognize the places where we jut up against our own limitations. Like
Mhm.
I did feel cruel looking back on myself and thinking like, God, you stupid bitch, like how could you have felt this thing? How could you have said this thing? How could you have behaved this way? And there was a lot of internalized hatred that sort of felt very residual from the period. And I wanted to figure out a way to incorporate that and like actually navigate it and mark it, to be honest. Because again, like so much of this book was about saying, like, I want to be as honest as possible. I don't
Right.
want to tidy things. I don't want to pretend I was a different kind of person than I was. I don't want to make myself out to be like, oh, yes, I actually was a perfect victim. And now everyone's going to sympathize with me. Like, I wasn't interested in that narrative.
Right.
And so,
Right.
like, I wanted to be able to document that recoil and that cruelty, and also to come to a place where I was able to forgive myself.
Mm. Um, I want to talk about the specter. So the specter happens in the she chapter. Um, and it's this like dark shadow that lurks in the corner while the character of Jamie is going about her day. It's very Lynchian. It also reminded me of a short story by Miranda July. I don't know if you've read it called Making Love in 2003.
I don't know.
Oh my God. Okay.
I
Well,
love her. I don't know it.
okay, so in it, it's like this really involved story, but she writes about a dark shape that comes into her room and like has sex with her as a child. And she keeps being like, this isn't a metaphor for rape. Not, and then like she keeps trying to find the dark shadow in people as she gets older. So I just felt like there was such there was such kinship in her shape and in yours. Um, can you talk to me about the influences you had for the Spectre and maybe why all women have a Spectre?
Yes, I will. I would love to universalize in that way because I think you're right. Um, yeah, also, do you follow Miranda July's Substack?
No, I should.
Right. Yeah, you should. Okay. Um, yeah, the specter was like such a strange thing that happened. And like I was saying, the first chapter, you know, originally I also wrote that in the first person. And I tried, I got through most of it in that form. And it felt so cheesy and hokey. And I was just like, this
Uh-huh.
is not feeling true.
Mhm.
Um, I think until I like solved the problem that was with that chapter, like I said earlier, the book didn't open up for me. And when I rewrote the chapter in third person, it just sort of like, yeah, it just fixed everything that felt wrong about it. And at that point, like I was saying a little bit earlier, it kind of made me feel empowered to play with conventions of other genres or other sort of writing approaches. Like it enabled me to feel like I could be more auto-fictional or to play with like novelistic conventions. Because obviously, like I said, I condense this period of time into a single day. And like, not all of these events happen on one. I didn't have like, one terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day or whatever. Like,
Mhm.
these are things that happened and are true to life, but that I sort of compressed into this smaller narrative. And so the Spectre was just sort of like that was an invention, like
Mhm.
that was a place where I like felt sort of free to do something a little stranger and a little more, I have such a fondness for magical realism and really like strange experimental women's literature. Like,
Yeah.
like my mentor in college turned me on to like Louisa Valenzuela and like Angela
Mhm.
Carter and Gail Jones and like women who were doing just sort of like very experimental shit. And so like that felt like a place where I wanted to just sort of play around. And it just occurred to me. And then at the end of the chapter, I was like, oh, I'm like doing something strange. Like the writing sometimes knows a little better than you do at the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
I got to the end, I was like, oh, right. Like I was sort of doing something formally with dissociation that I wasn't fully cognizant of until
Mhm.
I was like until the chapter was in the rear view. And the Spectre sort of follows Jamie H throughout the day. And I hope that I left it sort of inexplicable. Like I wanted it to have a lot of different possible meanings. Like obviously I have my reading of what it means. Um, but I think that there's something in there also about like my fascination with like horror stories and the paranoia that I was feeling at the time because of the violence that I had experienced. Like I felt incredibly paranoid. And I felt like I was not to be too graphic about it, but I was raped twice within this like under a year when I was
Mhm.
in grad school.
Mhm.
And I like had this sense that I was somehow like I had a target on my back or something.
Right.
And so, like, feeling that level of terror and uncertainty that also had a kind of certainty to it, which was like, oh, this is going to keep happening to me.
Mhm.
And feeling somehow like fated, I guess.
Right.
Like, feeling like that was sort of the thing that I had to deal with forever.
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm getting off track here.
No, no, no.
Yeah. So the Spectre is just sort of it meant a lot of different things to me, and I think I kind of tried to leave it with a lot of different possible meanings.
Right.
Sorry, did I answer your
No,
question?
yeah, you did. You did. I
Okay.
think I loved it because of this, like, I don't know if you know this Kelly Linkian concept of nighttime logic, which is like basically things that are only scary when you're alone.
Mhm.
Um, but it is very like trauma, it's like trauma informed fiction, where like it like breaks up logic, it like explodes logic so that like things only make sense because like they're in front of you, that they've happened, you've experienced them. So I was very excited about the Spectre.
Mhm.
um okay, I want to talk about the animals in your book. Some of my favorite parts have to do with Olive, your dog. And
I
there's
hope
this
I can see her back
she's
there.
right, oh my god, she's right there. um okay, so there's this really beautiful cathartic moment after you describe returning home from a brutal assault, rape, and the narrator Jamie is found. These dogs find her and they envelop her in love. And it's so tender, it's so beautiful. And I was like reminded a little bit of like dark fairy tales or just Disney princesses even, and princesses relationships to animals and innocent creatures. Um and there are moments throughout the memoir where you talk about like Olive's experience also being abused and abandoned. And there's almost moments where your bodies are going through similar things. So I wanted to know, like, what your perspective is on like the traumatized woman, the perfect victim, and her animals.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. Animals are so important to my life. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, no one's asked me this. This is great. Um, well, the moment you describe, it's funny. This was after I had moved to New York, and I was assaulted again in New York. And at the time, I was between apartments, and I was living with one of this guy who was a bar regular of mine at this dive bar I was working at. He had just started dating this woman, and she and I kind of immediately clicked. And I had I had lost my job and I had nowhere to go. And she was like, well, and she knew Olive, my dog, because I'd gotten Olive about a year before that, maybe a little less than that. And she was like, well, I'm not going to let Olive sleep on the street. So I guess the two of you are going to have to come live with me. And I was like, okay. And she was a dog walker. She had four of her own. And then Olive and I went and stayed with her. And she dog sat as well. So sometimes there would be like eight dogs in the house, like it was utter insanity, like a tiny ground floor apartment on Bedford Avenue in Bed-Stuy. But it was like, I kind of feel like that was the thing that saved me. It was like after that happened, I was just such a fucking wreck. And being sort of surrounded by creatures who like don't have that, I don't think, animals don't have sort of deliberated cruelty in them,
Yeah.
An animal is not going to like dehumanize you or like debase you in that way. And so I think that there's something about I don't know. I mean, I guess I haven't sort of like compiled a philosophy of animal life, but there's a level of there's a capacity for unconditional,
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think, that you experience with animals.
Hmm.
And I was such a, I also just was such a incredibly shy, like painfully shy child. I was painfully shy until I was a teenager. Um, and sort of forced myself out of that. But when I was a kid, I wasn't really able to connect with others very well, I don't think. And so my havens were books. Like I was always in the middle of a book. And then also like animals and like our dogs. Like we had dogs when I was a kid. And so like there's always just, except for when I was in grad school, I've always had animals sort of as this sort of very foundational part of my life. And a very like it's just sort of like this warm undercurrent of this sort of day to day. And
Hmm.
Olive is just like, yeah, I don't know. She's my everything. She and I
Yeah.
have been together for over 10 years now. And yeah, she kind of saved me, honestly.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Like just before I forget, yeah, the fairy tale thing is I love that. And yeah, fairy tales are so important to me. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis on feminist revisions of fairy tales.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, actually on Angela Carter, Anne Sexton, and Margaret Atwood. Someone who interviewed me a couple weeks ago was like, "I found your undergraduate thesis." I was
Oh
like,
my
"Well,
God.
how did you do that?" Like, that's crazy.
You're like, why?
No, it was wonderful. Like, it was like, oh, wow, I hadn't like made this connection. But, like I talk about Sleeping Beauty in the book. Like, I talk about,
Um,
there is something like, I think that fixation has continued like throughout my whole life. Maybe partly because when I was younger, one of the only my mom's brilliant and I love her, but she's not much of a reader. But she
mhm.
always loved fairy tales, and we would like read fairy tales,
Yeah.
feminist fairy tales. To that book, I forget who edited it, or maybe she wrote all of them. But there's that one book. It's just called Feminist Fairy Tales, and I like very specifically remember reading that with my mom when I was in middle or high school.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that sort of. The fairy tale logic is also sort of like the what you were talking about, like the
Nighttime logic. Yeah.
yeah, that's
Mhm.
sort of how fairy tales operate. And I think one of the things that is so fascinating is the way women kind of approach these master narratives in order to dismantle
Mhm. Mhm.
in terms of, particularly in terms of how these fables and fairy tales sort of structure the way that we imagine gender and sexuality and like what what are the parameters for a woman's life, right?
Right.
I think a
There's
lot
like a set of rules and you can't question them no matter how debasing or fucked up they are.
for sure. And yet women question them all the
Yes.
time. And
Yeah.
it actually when I was in that interview and the interviewer had asked me about my thesis, I like hadn't really pieced together that something that I was also doing with like the rape memoir was
Uh-huh.
about mantling a particular master narrative of what it means to survive trauma and like what kind of person is believable or what you're supposed to do afterwards, how you like construct a life after. And so thinking, yeah, I don't know, there felt like some sort of line of continuance between my interest in like how women dismantle fairy tales and how I was trying to sort of figure out this narrative that I didn't feel recognized by, but
Mhm.
still like needed to tell.
Right. I think also there's I mean, your interest in A Little Life and Jude being the center of that like the gothic fairy tale of A Little Life where bad things keep happening to him. Um, and I think I I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about A Little Life, because something I keep thinking about was I saw Hanya Yanagihara read from it, and she was getting flack for it from it already. And she was like, all I want people to know from this book is that like you can't save everybody, but you have to love them as much as possible anyway. Um, and Anyway, where am I going with this? I wanted to talk to you about okay, I completely just blanked. I just wanted to say that quote. um let's talk about the title trauma plot. You say, does art live in me not because of trauma, but because I saw beauty where there was none? I keep like saying that to people as I see them. I wrote it down in my notebook. I'm like, this is so beautiful. And I feel like the crux of this book is in that sentence. Can you talk to me about the title of this, maybe what it's in response to, and the relationship between art and trauma?
Sure. Yeah, well, it wasn't called Trauma Plot for its entire history.
Uh-huh.
I started writing in 2015, 2016. 2016 was when I started sort of keeping notes that eventually became this project. And for many years, the name for the book was Rape Girl,
Mhm.
and it felt it felt like a really confrontational sort of like title. I wanted to be. I'm trying to think. I changed it at this point 3 or 4 years ago, but
Mhm.
there was a point in time where like I was just so filled with rage, and I think that was an important part of the process was like allowing myself to have this fury, which I had never had. I think partly because I turned all the anger against myself for so long.
Mhm.
Um, and so like having this incredibly confrontational title that was very graphic, like particularly having the word rape in it, like felt very urgent to me in some way.
Yeah.
Because I didn't, again, like there's a sort of resistance to tidy things or to make them pretty.
Yeah.
Um, and so
I think
like that was
people are
what,
scared of saying the word too. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
And
Mhm.
like, that's sort of, I think that's something that I get into in the introduction. And there's this new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Mhm.
I think her name's Stephanie McCarter, but maybe I'm getting that wrong. She wanted to translate Metamorphoses because she was like, all these other translations sort of cover up the fact that these are rape stories. Like,
Right.
1 out of 5 of the Metamorphoses are about women getting raped, or like not
Right.
only women, but like about rape narratives and transformations that sort of come out of that. Um, and yeah, so like my feeling was for a long time that I really wanted to be in your face about it. You know, I was like, I'm gonna be so
Right.
radical, and
For
people are
sure.
gonna call my book Rape Girl
Yeah.
and really show them. Um, and I felt some reluctance when I had it on submission, and then when we sold it, basically, I don't know if this is gossip that I'm not supposed to repeat, but it's fine. Maybe I don't think it is. I think it's fine. Basically, I was told that I could keep the title, but I would have to like take half of the advance. Like I would be offered half the amount of money.
Oh my God.
No, I mean, like, and their logic made sense to me, you know, and I
Yeah.
don't know. Basically, they were like, if you have the word rape in the title, it will be algorithmically suppressed on Amazon, essentially. So
That's
like,
true.
so
Yeah.
you will not be searchable on Amazon because it's considered graphic content or like adult content or
Mm,
whatever. And so
right.
they were like, so you can keep it, but we can't offer you as much money because you're not going to sell as many books. And I
Mhm.
was like, okay, well, I need the money because like I don't want to fucking bartend forever.
Right.
So I agreed to change it. And the thing that occurred to me was that part of the reason I ended up finally deciding to publish the book was because of something I was seeing happen in literary criticism. So trauma plot, like the sort of terminological um, origin point is that Perel Segel article in the New Yorker called "The Case Against the Trauma Plot,"
Mhm.
and you know, just stating this flatly at the outset, I have no beef with Perel Segel. I think people keep thinking that that's what the thing is, and it wasn't that at all. Like I had disputes with that essay. I think it went incredibly viral in ways that essays never do anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
2021.
2021, December. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, I have like, yes, I have disputes with the sort of the the identification of this sort of like trauma canon
Yeah.
happened in that essay. But I think really the dispute felt more sort of like what the essay seemed to foment among other literary critics and readers. And whether, you know, regardless of the essay itself, I think what happened after that point was that the sort of backlash against Me Too, which feels sort of like a subplot within the ongoing anti-feminist backlash that has been happening since the 70s. Um, that sort of backlash against Me Too, which was happening basically coincident with Me Too occurring, right? Like as like months after, you know, a couple of months after Me Too went viral on Twitter, there's already all of these think pieces in the Atlantic and the New York Times about how Me Too's gone too far and all of this shit. And it felt like that backlash and that reactionary turn against traumatic testimony didn't happen in literary circles until 2021 and 2022, sort of when that essay came out. And I'm not
Mm,
saying like, you know, we don't control the sort of snowball effect of our work. Like once you publish something, it's
right.
out of your hands. And so I'm
Right.
not, again, like not to be like, oh, well, you know, this is a problem with her because it's not.
No,
I do
we've all
think
had a tweet go viral that changed culture, that
exactly.
shouldn't have.
Yeah. And so just like suddenly it felt like people kept talking about the trauma plot in this incredibly contrarian, reactionary
Yeah.
way that essentially, for one thing, there were a number of literary critics who I think sort of all hated A Little Life, and they had to form a
Yeah.
sort of retroactive repudiation of that novel by saying, actually, there's a problem with the trauma canon or something like that.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
like personally, like I don't exactly know what that means. I don't know what the trauma canon means for most people. Does it mean A Little Life and like two other books, you know? I think that if there is a canon of the Me Too era, it's still very much developing and we don't know what it's going to look like.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
it's been less than 10 years since Me Too.
yeah, exactly. So that feels like a sort of developing notion, but you know, so like among literary critics, it felt very sort of um not rigorous. You know,
Mhm.
it felt like it's fine to hate this book, sure. Like
Yeah.
I don't need to I do like it. I have a soft spot for it. I don't need to go to bat for it. Like it's just a book I like.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't necessarily know that hating that book means that there should be no books about trauma anymore,
Right.
or that they like anything that has to do with traumatic testimony is sort of easily dismissible as like idiotic or flat or Um,
Mhm.
the idea that like a character having trauma somehow makes that character perfectly transparent and explicable.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, like when I picked the project up and put it down like 100 times, and I really, when Me Too happened, I felt very animated at first, and then when the backlash was happening, I kind of was like, oh, wait. I mean, for one thing, there's this whole deluge of stories. Like everyone has a Me Too story at this point. I'm kind of like, do I really need to add to this? You know, like what do I have that's going to be different or going to be useful? And I sort of put it down. And then I kind of picked it back up, and then the Kavanaugh hearings happened, and I was like, okay, well, you know, this feels useless. Like it doesn't matter what we do.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, you know, Christine Blasey Ford has a memoir out that came out, I think, last year. And she said sort of the same thing. She was like, you know, I wasn't treated as a non-credible witness to what had happened to me. It's just that no one cared. And so
Yeah.
that felt like one of those really chilling moments. But then when I saw things happening in literary criticism, and everyone sort of suddenly had like this incredibly violent, you know, recoil from any kind of traumatic testimony in art and literature. I was like, you know, actually, I think I do have something here. Like, I do think that these stories are urgent, and like, I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think storytelling alone is going to end rape. Like, I'm not a political insurgent by writing this book, but I do think that storytelling is one mode of redress. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Totally. I think after reading your book, and this is what I have said about your book, is that it's like, it's not that writing saves us. It is that you literally have this account that you have lived, and that as you're writing this account, you're like, I'm alive, you know? And I think that is it's what's really special. Have you read Death Becomes Me by Cristina Rivera Garza? Or have
I
you heard of?
haven't. I love her, but I have not read that one.
Okay. So it's like recently translated, and it's about like a character named Cristina Rivera Garza, and she gets involved in this investigation where all these men are being killed and castrated. But the like thesis of the book is that a victim, like the victim in Spanish is always feminine, so it's víctima. And like what it like if something happens to you, if you are killed, if you are raped, you become this like feminine. So I feel like in that way, like um this like deluge of kind of like the hate against the trauma plot feels really misogynist. It feels like, like be in thinking that like if all victims are feminine, then this is like a way of saying like, shut up your feelings, like get over it, like we don't want to hear these kinds of stories.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that was the thing for me too, which is just sort of like the argument, you know, again, like I don't think my book is above criticism or something like that.
Mhm.
I don't think these stories are above, you know, being sort of put under the microscope, like as
Mhm.
narratives.
Mhm.
What I didn't like was that it felt as if the solution everyone kind of had was just silence, you know,
Yeah.
like shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to me like that doesn't actually feel like it doesn't feel like aesthetic criticism to me. It just feels kind of like shitty rape apologism, you know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Totally.
Yeah.
I have two more questions. Is that okay with we're starting at two for the Q&A, right?
Yeah, you can ask both three questions and take your
Okay, cool. So kind of along those lines, um, there's this like meta context of the book where you're talking about writing the book itself, and where the writer narrator is realizing it's really hard to structure and tell the story of rape because rape breaks time open, makes it dizzy, nearly undefinable. You say, is it my job or perhaps my crime to assemble plot, to force on your behavior an ineluctable causality? Can you talk to me about what, and I know you said that there's this like level of cruelty in which you're talking to the you in the past, but in what ways, like, maybe this is a weird question, like, is writing like a violence?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it was an ongoing question for me during the writing of the book, and it's kind of an open-ended question for me now.
Mhm.
I think, are you referencing the part where I sort of pause and I address, like, sort of do an address to my previous self, but like sort of also to the reader in the third chapter?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there was a moment where, again, like I was sort of assembling this almost like a biography of old Jamie, previous Jamie. And I was plugging in various pieces of my diary to form this narrative thread across that period of time. And I, as life writers, there's always this question of personal sort of like writerly ethics, right? Like I feel like that's sort of the thing. And of course, again, like speaking of things that are sort of like lodged against women, but very rarely
Mhm.
against men. I think that women who write about our lives are always expected to take on the onus of responsibility for sort of safeguarding others,
Yeah.
and caretaking for others when we write about our lives. Like everyone has a story of their life.
Mhm.
Those stories, I have to imagine all of those stories include other people, and it would be very sad if it
Right.
didn't.
Right.
Um, and I do, I think when I write about my life and I involve other people, I try to be, it's a fine line balancing honesty and sort of making sure that I don't inflict harm. Like I don't want to impugn someone's dignity or to take away their power to write their own story. And
Mhm.
it is, for me, like it is something that feels very present in how I imagine writing.
Mhm.
Um, and so like I guess the question just sort of cropped up for me when I was doing that to myself. It was like, what
Mm.
is the narrative I'm constructing of myself? And like because I had that sense, that cruel feeling where I was embarrassed or sort of like how could you have been this way, I was like, well, am I being somehow less careful, less cautious, less ethical and sort of handling my life than I
Mm.
would someone else's? Um, as far as like I think my baseline answer is like, do I think that writing about myself is violent? No. Do I think that the process of this book was often re-traumatizing? Yes.
Yeah.
Like, it was very difficult. And like I had many points where I was like, am I in fact writing this book to extend the the period of trauma, you know?
Right.
And there were a lot of sort of circling questions where like I kind of had like a curiosity around why I took so long to write it, and why I held on to it and why I felt kind of protective of it. And I wondered, these are sort of like contradictory but simultaneous feelings, which is like, am I holding on to this story in order to stay in the pain, you know?
Mm.
And then I was like, but am I writing it to inflict further pain on
Yeah.
myself? There just didn't seem to be like a resolution there. And I don't know what the answer is. But
Right.
I think the thing that I knew was that, and this is sort of exactly what my agent said to me, which was like a really revelatory moment where she was like, if you don't finish this book, you're never going to write another book. And
Wow.
it's like, that is true. Like, I like other fucking books. Like, I want to write, maybe one day I'll write a happy book. Who knows?
Right.
Like I don't know. I want to write a novel. Like I have a novel idea that I've been like
Right.
sort of playing with, and I've been writing short fiction again. It's like I think that sort of in the way that the specter was haunting me in my first chapter in the book, there's like this was the monolith of my sort of creative life for over a decade.
Mhm.
And I needed to get it out, and I had to sort of bracket whether or not I was being violent to myself. Am
Right.
I doing
Right.
something wrong? Am I treating myself unethically? I was sort of like, well, then I shall treat myself unethically because I have to get this out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for all of the unhappiness of the book, it ends so optimistically and it is really life affirming. And I feel like you can't get to that moment. And the same way that like the moment with the dogs enveloping you is so powerful, it's like you have to get through all of that shit in order to like land somewhere like where the sun is out and it's spring, you know? Um, okay, the last thing I want to talk to you about or ask you about is if you could talk about being a working writer. I know you work as a bartender and have been supporting yourself like this in order to keep writing. Um, I feel like it's really useful for other writers to hear about, those struggles and like where what you hope to be writing next.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's funny, actually, my group chat and I, the three of us have been doing kind of like a women's roundtable where we talk about our positions in the writing world. And we were talking quite a bit about this because Charlotte, Charlotte Shane, was like, "Oh, I really like how you always refer to us as working writers," which I think it does feel important to me in a way, particularly, not to be like, "Oh, we're the best people in the world. I'm the best woman in the world, and I work harder than anyone else," or something like that. But I think that there is something to be said about how difficult it is right now to be in any sort of art world, like to operate in any art world capacity, whether that be literature, criticism, or being a painter or whatever without a sort of scaffolding of serious income. Like I think, particularly post COVID, I've seen so many artists sort of exiled from the entire apparatus.
Mhm.
And it feels frightening that there is such little room for working class people
Yeah,
in arts and in writing. And I still feel like such an interloper. I go to, I go to these parties and I'm like, God, I'm like the poorest person here. And maybe that's not true anymore now that I like have, I sold this book or whatever.
mm,
But it is strange to sort of be surrounded, I think, at times by people who like don't quite have to cobble together so many forms of income.
right.
Um, but it is possible, I guess, is the thing I would say if I'm sort of being the wise woman in this moment. It's like it's not fucking easy. It's not an easy life. And like when I got my advance for this book, it was the most money I'd ever seen. And and it's still not that fucking much, like it gets doled out over 3 years. It's not enough to live on,
Right.
period. Um, and one of the things that I was very insistent on was that I was not going to quit my other jobs. I think a lot of people take the advance and they say, I'm going to focus only on this thing.
Right.
And I just couldn't afford to do that. And so I bartended through it and I freelanced through the writing of the book. And it was an incredibly tough 2 years. I feel like I kind of look back and I'm like, I don't really know how I managed to write this book.
Yeah.
But um, yeah, sorry, I'm just sort of ranting about how hard it is to be a
It's
worker.
hard.
It fucking sucks. I mean, we were talking about this, last
Yeah.
night. You were
Yeah.
bartending, and I was at the bar bartending until 2 in the morning, and I'm just sort of
Right.
like, God, I would love to not be doing this.
Yeah, it's like it sucks.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I feel of two minds about it too, though, sometimes because I'm sort of like, in a way, when I was writing the book, it felt maybe like a great thing to keep my toe in the world of other people,
totally.
you know,
Yeah.
because
Right.
writing is such an isolating experience.
Right.
And one of the things that was really difficult was like I on my days off, I was sitting in my bedroom for 8 or 10 hours a day writing about getting raped. And like that fucking sucked. And so, like, like in a certain sense, like being at the bar, like I really hate bartending. I truly do. And I think anyone who's ever seen me bartend knows that I do. I'm like good at it, but I'm not like a happy bartender.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it was important, I think, to sort of remain in the world of the living in some way.
Totally. And I think your work is really reflective of that as much as it is about like the confessional, it is like frequently in conversation with other forms of art, other people. You mention your friends a lot. Like you're a writer who's like in conversation with the world and you're living in it.
Yeah, that feels
Yeah.
very important to me. And I
Yeah.
think also, to take it back very briefly to the book, and then I guess we can open up to Q&A, but like that was something that I didn't feel for so long in my life. Like I didn't feel like I was part of the world. Like I felt like I was fucking dead, for many, many years. Like I was sort of like the walking dead and
Yeah.
like being able to figure out how to position myself in the world and with others and to
Hmm.
trust others and to
Hmm.
be social and to be open and
Yeah.
to long for beauty and for life,
Yeah.
like that felt like such a pivot in my experience of the
Hmm.
world. Like preserving that and trying to document that felt like this really essential thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking to me, Jamie.
You, this is
Um,
so fun.
yeah. We're gonna transition to the Q&A. Um,
Thank you so much, Jamie and Melissa. That was so wonderful. We have quite a few questions from the audience. The first question is from Isabella. Carmen Maria Machado wrote a memoir which centered an abusive relationship, and since publication, she has said that she sometimes, but not always, regrets releasing something so personal into the world. How do you reconcile using your experience for/in your art with that existing in the public sphere?
Sure. Thank you for that. I in the Dream House, I assume is the one that you're referring to, and I think that's a brilliant book. And it actually felt very important to me, in terms of imagining what a memoir about violence that I had experienced, like sort of the experimentation that happens in that book just felt very revelatory to me and made me feel like I could do something a little weirder in my book. But sorry, I feel like I lost my train of thought. As far as like, I think part of what you're wondering about is like possible regrets, maybe. Um, I don't know because the book's not out in the world yet. Like I've said this to many people, like it's very frightening, I think particularly in this political moment where I don't know. I feel, I think I'm fundamentally an optimist. I think looking at sort of global circumstances and American political realities, I feel very demoralized a lot of times. I think particularly, I mean, how many rapists can they invite to the White House? Um, and so there is a concern for me about releasing a memoir about rape in a moment where like we're living in a country that is kind of explicitly pro-rape. Um, it's scary. And I never wanted to go through a rape trial. I didn't. Um, and there's part of me that's worried that like the book will kind of be that like I'm going to be litigated as a survivor of sexual violence. I don't know. I just I can't see what the tale of the book is going to be yet. But if the question is, am I scared? Yes. But I still think that I did important work, and I can't imagine. I try to live at this point in my life. I try to live without regrets. I try to just navigate the decisions that I make, and then continue navigating them. And that's all I can really sort of count on and hope for.
Thank you for that answer, Jamie. The next question is you raised very trenchant critique of Me Too in your reading, and as you noted, we're now seeing a cultural backlash against Me Too. Is there a version of the movement you see that could be more broad-based and egalitarian, and does literature have the capacity to complicate the narrative of the perfect victim?
I think that, I mean, it's hard to imagine what Me Too would have been if it had done everything right. Like I think that again, maybe this is sort of dovetailing on what I was just saying, which is like I just sort of have to navigate the realities of what Me Too has been and the way it has deflated. I think a lot of it's not that again, I have critiques of Me Too, but I do think I was talking with a friend about this yesterday. The thing about Me Too that we don't talk about anymore is that when it happened, it felt incredibly powerful. It felt incredibly revolutionary. Like there was an energy in the air that feels to me very indescribable, and I think has vanished, which is devastating. Um, but I don't think, and this happened with like the Ferguson protests. Like this happened, there was a period of time between like 2016 and 2020 where it felt like there was real political change in the air. And I don't exactly know how we would get back to that, but I do think it's possible. I do think that we all had that feeling and we shared it and we like and I think right now, like we're looking at particularly in like campus protests around the genocide of the Palestinians, like it feels like there is still an incredibly revolutionary moment happening. It's just being so violently suppressed. And that is also devastating, but I think that we can get back to a place where we can actually make the world, imagine the world and make it better. Um, Sorry, I feel like I lost the second part of that question though.
The second part of the question, does literature have the capacity to complicate the narrative of the perfect victim?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that that was one of the things that was really important to me. As I was saying to Melissa earlier, um, one of the big hurdles for me was like, am I going to write a memoir that gets me sympathy, or am I going to write a memoir that makes me feel like I've told the story in an honest way? And I think I did the latter. And I think that there are places in the book where I am incredibly, I'm a very, I'm someone who's kind of difficult to sympathize with. And I am clearly not a perfect victim. I never was, and that was never going to be a true story for me. Um, but preserving that ambivalence and preserving the sort of murkiness, the gray area of my life and like my behavior. And it was also about trying to preserve a sense of myself as an agent in my life. Like I could have played like I was a helpless nothing from the time I was 6 and all of these things just happened to me. Or I could have been like I was present in my life, even if I didn't often feel that way. And I did make decisions that I maybe wouldn't make today. Um, and I was not a perfect victim. And yet I still didn't deserve what happened to me. And I think preserving that, holding those two, like multiple things together, and at the same time, that felt like the real sort of crucial thing for telling this story. And I think that that does, I hope it opens up space for other people to sort of feel, I don't know, more empowered to recognize themselves and these kinds of narratives and to feel less alone.
Jamie, our last question is going to come from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Min. Thank you so much, Jamie and Melissa, again for joining us. And Jamie, thank you for bringing this absolutely brilliant work into the world. It's obviously an astoundingly powerful story, but I was also really blown away by the craft of your writing. There's just so many beautiful sentences that I was like scribbling down, as Melissa was saying, in my notebook and like leaving for later in my head. I have sort of a like nerdy writer sort of craft advice question, which is, you talk about in the introduction and even here today how you wanted to tell the story and you were trying to figure out what the right form was and sort of playing with that. It's going to be this epic poem, is it, and settled on the form that you did. I'm wondering if you have any advice for writers that might be here, like myself, who have a story that they are working on that they haven't found the correct form for, and how you sort of played around with that and then figured out what felt right for you and for the story.
Yeah, I like this question. It's a tough one though. Um, I think the thing that I would say with the most coherence is like you just kind of have to play around. And you have to try a lot of different shit, and a lot of it's not going to work. Like maybe this is the thing that's going to turn you off from whatever project you're working on. But like, as I said before, I worked on this book for 10 years. And like the majority of the serious writing that appears in the published version of the book, that happened around probably 18 months between 2022 and 2024. Um, but there were so many versions of this book. I mean, Melissa brought up hypergraphia. Like there are thousands of pages of draft iterations of this book. I wrote 100 pages of a book length poem that was going to be what I thought this project would become, like way almost 10 years ago. And it wasn't working. And I had to say, like, okay, well, this doesn't feel right. And it was horrible to say, I worked so hard. I worked for multiple years on this long narrative poem that felt really powerful to me at moments. And it just was not the right thing. And I just had to trash it. And that fucking sucks. Like it really feels super bad when you work as hard as we all work as writers on something, and you just have to reckon with the fact that it isn't going to be that. And I bring up that Annie Dillard quote in the introduction of the book where she talks about, she sort of imagines it as building a house, and she's like, sometimes you build an entire foundation of a house and like you're not even able to save a brick, like sometimes everything has to be demolished. And that's a scary thing, but that is writing, that is making art. Like if you want to be, I think, if you want to be an artist, it's hard. If you want to be a writer, it's a hard fucking life. I mean, obviously, I say that fully cognizant of the fact that it's also an incredible privilege and honor to be able to do the work that we do. But for me, I'm a very hybrid writer. I get very restless formally, and I often dance between genres. Um, for a long time, I was like, I'm a poet, but I also had a background in scholarly work because I did a PhD. And then after I published my first book, which was also a hybrid book, I was like, I don't want to write about myself for 2 years. I don't want to do that. It's too much. Because my first book was also very intimate and personal. And I kind of stuck to that promise. Like for 2 years, I was just like, I'm just going to write criticism. And I did. And when I came, not that I'm done with that, but I finally felt ready to write about myself again. But I also felt like I had kind of learned a lot by challenging myself to sort of work in a critical mode for a long time. And that was also an unlearning process because when I started doing criticism for magazines, everyone was like, you sound like an academic. And like, that's boring and no one wants that. I was like, you're right. Like that, I do sound like that. And it is boring and no one wants it. And so like I had to learn how to stretch these new muscles to be able to write, like to review other people's books for magazine audiences. And so I think challenging yourself to just kind of try out different forms. You might suck in some of them. Like I suck in some of them. I don't like I said, I'm working on fiction right now and it's not my background and I don't know if it works. And I may write the worst novel of all time. And I just have to face that as a possibility. But I want to write it nonetheless. And if it gets trashed at the end, then it does. So yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I went on for a million years, but yeah, I think you just have to like be willing to take risks and be willing to put a lot of time in and a lot of energy in, knowing that sometimes that time and energy is going to feel kind of wasted.
See, Jamie. We're gonna conclude today's NSC with another reading from Jamie. Jamie, whenever you're ready, you can take it over.
Oh yeah, sure. So men asked me to read something just like a poem or something that I love. And I figured because the book is such an ode to confessional writing and because Sylvia Plath appears so much, I just thought I would read one of my favorite poems by Plath, which is called Tulips. The tulips are too excitable. It is winter here. Look how white everything is, how quiet, how snowed in. I am learning peacefulness, lying by myself quietly as the light lies on these white walls, this bed, these hands. I am nobody. I have nothing to do with explosions. I have given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses, and my history to the anesthetist, and my body to surgeons. They have propped my head between the pillow and the sheet cuff like an eye, between two white lids that will not shut. Stupid pupil. It has to take everything in. The nurses pass and pass. They are no trouble. They pass the way gulls pass inland in their white caps, doing things with their hands, one just the same as another, so it is impossible to tell how many there are. My body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water tends to the pebbles it must run over, smoothing them gently. They bring me numbness in their bright needles. They bring me sleep. Now I have lost myself. I am sick of baggage. My patent leather overnight case like a black pillbox. My husband and child smiling out of the family photo. Their smiles catch on to my skin, little smiling hooks. I have let things slip. A 30-year-old cargo boat stubbornly hanging on to my name and address. They have swabbed me clear of my loving associations. Scared and bare on the green plastic pillowed trolley, I watched my tea set, my bureaus of linen, my books sink out of sight, and the water went over my head. I am a nun now. I have never been so pure. I didn't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie with my hands turned up and be utterly empty. How free it is. You have no idea how free. The peacefulness is so big, it dazes you. And it asks nothing. A name tag, a few trinkets. It is what the dead close on, finally. I imagine them shutting their mouths on it, like a communion tablet. The tulips are too red in the first place. They hurt me. Even through the gift paper, I could hear them breathe lightly through their white swaddlings, like an awful baby. Their redness talks to my wound. It corresponds. They are subtle. They seem to float, though they weigh me down, upsetting me with their sudden tongues and their color, a dozen red lead sinkers round my neck. Nobody watched me before. Now I am watched. The tulips turn to me, and the windows behind me, where once a day the light slowly widens and slowly thins, and I see myself, flat, ridiculous, a cut paper shadow between the eye of the sun and the eyes of the tulips. And I have no face. I've wanted to efface myself. The vivid tulips eat my oxygen. Before they came, the air was calm enough, coming and going, breath by breath, without any fuss. Then the tulips filled it up like a loud noise. Now the air snags and eddies round them the way a river snags and eddies round a sunken rust-red engine. They concentrate my attention. That was happy, playing and resting without committing itself. The walls also seem to be warming themselves. The tulips should be behind bars, like dangerous animals. They are opening like the mouth of some great African cat. And I am aware of my heart. It opens and closes its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. The water I taste is warm and salt, like the sea, and comes from a country far away as health. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie and Melissa, for such an incredible conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation on Art Oh My, and as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks so
Jamie.
much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Bye
It's a great
bye.
conversation.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.